The world smelled like dust and forgotten things. That's the first thing I remember about the day my life split into two pieces, the before and the after. I was sitting on the floor of my bedroom, the pink floral wallpaper that Mom had picked out watching over me. My friends were all gathered around, waiting for my decision. There was Barnaby, the bear whose button eye Dad had sewn back on 3 times, his thread a little crooked but strong. There was Princess Amelia, the doll with the tangled golden hair, and the small army of plastic dinosaurs that roared silently from their corner. They were the most important people I knew, besides Mom and Dad. I was carefully trying to decide who would get to come with me. My small red suitcase was already half full with clothes I didn't recognize. They were stiff and smelled like Aunt Eleanor's house, a smell of mothballs and something sharp like old perfume. Aunt Eleanor was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. She wasn't like Mom, who was soft and smelled like cinnamon and vanilla. Aunt Eleanor was all sharp angles and quiet spaces. She didn't smile with her eyes, only with her mouth, and it never quite looked real. "You can only choose one, Sophie," she said. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering across pavement. My hands hovered over Barnaby. He was my oldest friend. He had listened to every secret, absorbed every tear. But then my gaze fell on the dinosaurs. They were for adventures. Maybe where we were going was an adventure. I looked up at her, my heart doing a funny little jump in my chest. "I asked if I could bring my toys," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "Plural, more than one." Aunt Eleanor's thin lips pressed together. She took a step into the room and the floorboards creaked. She looked at the suitcase, then at my collection of friends on the floor, and finally her eyes, cool and gray like a winter sky, landed on me. "You won't need them where you're going," she said. The words didn't make any sense. Not need them? I always needed them. Barnaby helped me sleep when thunderstorms were angry. The dinosaurs helped me be brave. How could I not need them? A confusing swirl of questions filled my head. Where were we going? It felt like a secret, a grown-up secret that floated just out of my reach. Mom and Dad were good at secrets, but their secrets were fun, like surprise trips for ice cream or a new book hidden under my pillow. This secret felt heavy. "Why?" I whispered. "Because you're a big girl now," she answered. But that wasn't a real answer. I was 8. I wasn't a big girl. I was just me. She reached down and, with a swift, certain movement, picked up Barnaby the bear. For a terrifying second, I thought she was going to put him in the get-rid-of pile. Instead, she tucked him firmly into the red suitcase on top of the strange clothes. "One," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Now put your shoes on. The car is waiting." The car ride was quiet. I'd never been in a car that was so quiet. When Dad drove, he would sing off-key to the radio and tell bad jokes that made Mom groan and me giggle. When Mom drove, she'd ask me about my day, about what I learned in school, about the stories I was making up in my head. But Aunt Eleanor just drove. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and her eyes were fixed on the road ahead. I sat in the back, the scratchy seatbelt pressing against my neck. Barnaby was locked away in the trunk inside the suitcase. I felt a hollow space in my arms where he was supposed to be. I pressed my face against the cool glass of the window, watching my street slide away. I saw Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses, a blur of red and pink. I saw the big oak tree with the tire swing Dad had hung for me last summer. I saw the roof of my school. Then we turned onto the highway and everything became a swirl of green and gray. I thought about Mom and Dad. They had left 2 days ago. "A trip for work," Mom had said, kissing my forehead. Her eyes looked shiny, like she was holding back tears, but I didn't understand why. Dad had hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "Be good for your Aunt Eleanor, Sophie Bear," he'd murmured into my hair. "We love you more than all the stars in the sky." I missed them so much it felt like a stomach ache. Maybe this was the surprise. Maybe Aunt Eleanor was driving me to meet them. Maybe we were going to a new house, a secret adventure house, and Mom and Dad were already there, blowing up balloons and setting up a welcome banner. The idea was a little spark of warmth in the cold, quiet car. I held on to it. "Is this a surprise?" I asked the back of Aunt Eleanor's head. She glanced at me in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were there, and then gone. "Something like that," she said. We drove for what felt like forever. The sun, which had been high in the sky when we left, began to dip lower, painting the clouds orange and purple. My stomach rumbled. At home, Mom would be starting dinner. The house would smell of roasting chicken or spaghetti sauce. I wondered what they were having for dinner in the secret adventure house. Finally, just as the last bits of daylight were fading, Aunt Eleanor turned off the main road. We drove down a long, gravel driveway lined with tall, skinny trees that looked like dark fingers pointing at the sky. At the end of it was a house. It wasn't a secret adventure house. It was big, bigger than any house I'd ever seen, and it was made of dark stone that seemed to swallow the light. It had a pointy roof and lots of windows, but no lights were on inside. They looked like dark, empty eyes. Aunt Eleanor stopped the car. The only sound was the crunching of the gravel as the tires settled. She turned off the engine, and the silence that rushed in was even bigger and emptier than the silence in the car. "Here we are," she said. It didn't sound like a happy announcement. It just sounded like a fact, like saying the sky is blue or the grass is green. I stared at the giant, shadowy house. A shiver went through me that had nothing to do with the evening chill. This wasn't a place for adventures. This wasn't a place for toys. A cold, heavy feeling started to bloom in my chest, pushing out the little spark of hope I had been holding. For the first time, I felt truly scared. Where were we? Aunt Eleanor got out of the car, her movements stiff and efficient. She walked to the trunk and I heard the click as it opened. I stayed put, my hands clutching the seatbelt. I didn't want to get out. I wanted to rewind the day, go back to my pink wallpapered room with all my friends where the world made sense. A heavy door with a large iron knocker opened with a groan, spilling a pale yellow light onto the gravel. A tall, very thin woman stood silhouetted in the doorway. "Eleanor," the woman's voice was sharp, cutting through the evening quiet. "You're late." "The traffic was heavier than expected, Mrs. Blackwood," Aunt Eleanor replied. She pulled my small red suitcase from the trunk and set it on the ground. Then she looked at me, still in the back seat. She didn't come to open my door. She just waited. Slowly, I unbuckled my seatbelt and pushed the door open. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I walked towards the house, my feet dragging, feeling as small as one of my plastic dinosaur toys. As I got closer, I could see Mrs. Blackwood better. She was older than Aunt Eleanor, with hair the color of salt and pepper pulled into a tight bun that looked like it hurt. She wore a dark dress with a white collar, and she wasn't smiling. "This is she?" Mrs. Blackwood asked, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. I felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. "This is Sophie," Aunt Eleanor confirmed. She gave my shoulder a little push, urging me forward into the light of the doorway. The hall inside was enormous. The floor was made of black and white tiles, like a giant chessboard, and they were so shiny I could see a blurry, stretched-out version of myself in them. A grand staircase swept up into the shadows on one side. The walls were lined with dark wooden panels, and the only furniture was a single, tall-backed chair that looked like a throne. The air was cold and smelled of lemon polish and something else. Something like old paper. There were no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the floor. It didn't feel like a house. It felt like a museum where nothing was allowed to be touched. "Well, she looks healthy enough," Mrs. Blackwood said, still talking about me as if I wasn't there. "We'll need to see the paperwork, of course." "It's all in my bag," Aunt Eleanor said. She placed her handbag on the throne chair and began to rummage through it. I stood in the middle of the giant chessboard, clutching the straps of my small backpack. I wanted my mom. The thought was so sharp and painful it made my eyes sting. Mom would never bring me to a place like this. This wasn't an adventure house. This was a sad house. Mrs. Blackwood's gaze fell on the red suitcase that Aunt Eleanor had carried in. "Is that all of her belongings?" "It is," Aunt Eleanor said, pulling out a thick envelope. "We have a standard issue of clothing. It ensures uniformity and prevents attachments," Mrs. Blackwood stated. Her eyes flickered towards me. "She can keep one personal item, provided it is appropriate. A book, perhaps, or a photograph." My heart hammered against my ribs. My suitcase. Barnaby was in my suitcase. He was my one thing, the only piece of home I had left. They couldn't take him away. Aunt Eleanor handed the envelope to Mrs. Blackwood, who took it without a word and began to inspect the contents. My aunt then turned to me. Her face was tired, and in the dim yellow light of the hall, she looked almost sad. "Sophie," she began, crouching down so her face was level with mine. It was the first time she had really looked at me all day. "You're going to be staying here for a while." "With you?" I asked, a tiny, fragile bit of hope fluttering in my chest. She shook her head. The hope died. "No, I have to go back. This is a special school, Sophie, for children whose parents have to be away for a very long time." "For work?" I whispered, repeating the words Mom had said. Aunt Eleanor's eyes faltered for just a second. She looked away towards the dark wood of the walls. "Yes," she said, her voice strained. "For work." I knew she was lying. It wasn't the same kind of lie as a surprise party. It was a grown-up lie, a heavy one that hung in the air between us, cold and suffocating. "I want to go home," I said, and this time my voice didn't whisper. It came out strong, even though I was trembling. "I want Mom and Dad." "I know you do," she said softly, "but they can't be with you right now. You need to be brave." "I can't be brave without my dinosaurs," I said, the tears I'd been holding back finally spilling over and running down my cheeks. Mrs. Blackwood looked up from her papers. "Crying will not change the situation," she said, her voice flat and final. "Eleanor, your part here is done. The transition is always smoother if the departure is swift." Aunt Eleanor stood up. She looked down at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might hug me. I thought she might say something soft and kind, a secret message of comfort just for me. But she just reached out and brushed a stray piece of hair from my face, her touch as light and quick as a moth's wing. "Be a good girl, Sophie," she said. Then she turned, picked up her handbag, and walked out the heavy front door, closing it behind her with a soft, definitive click. She didn't look back. I was alone. Alone on a giant chessboard floor in a cold, empty hall, with a strange woman who looked at me like I was a problem to be solved. The silence rushed back in, bigger and deeper than before. The only sound was the rustle of papers as Mrs. Blackwood tucked the envelope away. She walked over to my red suitcase and placed her long, bony hand on the handle. "Come along, child," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "It's time to get you settled in. We have a great many rules here at the Blackwood School for young ladies. The first one you will learn is that we do not need toys here." Her words echoed Aunt Eleanor's from earlier that day. They hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. This wasn't a school. It was a place where toys went to be forgotten, and I was a toy they were putting away on a shelf. Mrs. Blackwood's hand was cold on the suitcase handle, but her grip was like iron. She didn't take my hand. She just started walking towards the grand staircase, and I knew I was supposed to follow. Every step I took on the black and white tiles was an echo in the vast, silent hall. I felt like a pawn being moved across a board in a game I didn't understand. We climbed the stairs. The wood was dark and polished, and a thin, threadbare runner muffled our footsteps. The air grew colder as we ascended. We walked down a long hallway that was a perfect copy of the one below, only instead of wood panels, the walls were covered in a faded, striped wallpaper. There were dozens of closed doors, all painted the same shade of dull cream. They all looked exactly the same. Mrs. Blackwood stopped in front of one, produced a key from a pocket in her dress, and unlocked it. The room was small and spare. It contained 2 small beds, each made up with a thin gray blanket pulled so tight it looked like you could bounce a coin on it. Between them was a single nightstand with a lamp. On the far wall, a tall, narrow window looked out into the deepening darkness. There were no pictures, no toys, no color, except for the gray of the blankets and the cream of the walls. A small wooden wardrobe stood against one wall. It was the saddest room I had ever seen. "This will be your room," Mrs. Blackwood announced, her voice echoing slightly in the bare space. "The bed by the window is yours. You will have a roommate. She is currently at evening studies." She placed my red suitcase on the empty bed and clicked it open. I held my breath. Her long, pale fingers sifted through the unfamiliar clothes Aunt Eleanor had packed. They paused. Then they closed around Barnaby. She lifted him out, holding him by one arm so he dangled in the air. I took a step forward, my hands clenched into fists. "He's my one thing," I said, my voice trembling but loud in the quiet room. Mrs. Blackwood looked at the bear. She saw his lopsided button eye, the worn patches on his fur where I'd held him tight for years. Her expression didn't change. It was like looking at a stone. "We do not encourage sentimental attachments," she said. "They are a distraction from a proper education." "He helps me be brave," I pleaded, tears threatening again. I thought of what the other girl, Chloe, had said in my head. "Don't cry where she can see you." I blinked hard, trying to keep them in. For a long moment, she just stared at the bear. I thought she was going to take him, to toss him into a bin with all the other forgotten toys from all the other forgotten children. My whole body braced for the loss. "One item is permitted," she finally said, her voice clipped. She placed Barnaby on the pillow of my bed. "He will remain on your bed. He is not to be carried around the school. He is not to be present at meals or in the classroom. Is that understood?" I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. It was a victory, but it felt like a tiny one. "Good," she said. She closed the empty suitcase and slid it under my bed. Then she went to the wardrobe and opened it. Inside, hanging on a hook, was a single gray dress, just like the one Mrs. Blackwood wore but without the white collar. This is your uniform. You will wear it every day. Your other clothes will be stored. You will find your nightgown and toiletries in the top drawer. You are to be washed and in your nightgown in 10 minutes. Lights are out at 9 o'clock precisely. Another girl will come to collect you for breakfast at 7 in the morning. Rules are the foundation of this institution, Sophie. You will learn them quickly. Without another word, she turned and left, closing the door behind her. I heard the lock click. I was locked in. I ran to the bed and snatched Barnaby, holding him so tight his button eye pressed into my cheek. He still smelled a little bit like home, like my laundry detergent and the faintest hint of my mom's perfume. I buried my face in his soft, worn fur, and finally let out the sob I had been holding back. The room was so empty it seemed to swallow the sound. After a few minutes, I wiped my eyes and looked around again. I went to the window and peered out. All I could see was darkness and the vague shapes of more tall, skinny trees. There were no streetlights, no other houses, no signs of life at all. I felt like I was at the end of the world. I opened the drawer Mrs. Blackwood had mentioned. Inside was a plain white nightgown and a small bag containing a toothbrush, a tube of toothpaste, and a bar of soap that smelled faintly of lavender. It was a lonely collection of things. I changed into the nightgown, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar against my skin. The gray uniform dress hung in the wardrobe like a little ghost. I was just climbing into the stiff, cold bed when the door unlocked and opened. A girl stood in the doorway. She was about my age, with dark hair cut into a short, practical bob. She was already wearing her white nightgown. She looked at me, her eyes wide and curious, but she didn't say anything. "Hello?" I whispered. The girl closed the door softly behind her and padded over to the other bed. "You're the new one," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Sophie." "I'm Chloe," she said, her voice quiet. She sat on her bed, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at Barnaby, who I was still clutching. "You got to keep him?" I nodded, pulling him closer. "Mrs. Blackwood said I could." Chloe looked surprised. "She usually takes everything. She took my locket." She looked down at her hands. It had a picture of my mom in it. The sadness in her voice was a quiet, tired thing. It made my own sadness feel less lonely. "My Aunt Eleanor told me my parents were away for work," I said, needing to tell someone. "It's a secret adventure." Chloe looked up at me, and her expression was old, much older than her face. It was the kind of look my dad would give me when I said something that was childishly wrong. "My parents are away for work too," she said, her voice flat. "That's what they tell all of us." The way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. The last flickering ember of hope, the one that insisted this was all a big, complicated surprise, finally went out, leaving nothing but cold ash. We sat in silence for a moment. Two strangers in matching nightgowns in a room that felt like a cage. A loud bell rang somewhere in the house, a jarring, metallic sound. Chloe immediately lay down and pulled her gray blanket up to her chin. "That's the 9 o'clock bell," she whispered across the small space between our beds. "You have to be in bed with your head on the pillow. Sometimes she checks." I quickly scrambled under my own blanket. The sheets were icy cold. A second later, the lamp on the nightstand clicked off by itself, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The days at the Blackwood School for Young Ladies bled into one another, each one a perfect gray copy of the last. We woke at 7, to the sound of the bell. We dressed in our identical gray uniforms. We ate our silent breakfast of lumpy oatmeal. We sat through hours of lessons where we learned long division and the names of kings and queens, but never laughed or asked curious questions. Everything was about rules and silence. Mrs. Blackwood seemed to be everywhere at once, a silent ghost in a dark dress, her presence a constant reminder that we were being watched. My world shrank to the size of the school's cold stone walls. The only color, the only warmth, was Chloe. In the sliver of time between being locked in our room and the 9 o'clock bell, we would whisper. Our whispers were the most precious things we had. We didn't talk about what we learned in class. We talked about before. I told her about my pink wallpaper, about Dad's silly jokes and the smell of Mom's baking. She told me about her little brother and the treehouse they had in their backyard, and a dog named Patches who would lick her face until she giggled. We talked about our parents. For the first week, I clung to the story Aunt Eleanor had told me. "They're on a work trip," I'd say. "It's very important work." Chloe would just look at me with those old, sad eyes of hers. Then one night, after I'd been there for what felt like a year but was probably only a month, she finally told me the truth. "My mom isn't on a work trip, Sophie," she whispered, her voice barely a breath in the darkness. "She got sick, really sick. My dad, He couldn't take care of me and my brother and her all at the same time, so he sent me here. I lay still in my bed, the icy sheets suddenly feeling even colder. Barnaby was tucked under my arm, his button eye staring into the darkness. And my friend Sarah? Chloe continued, her voice trembling slightly. Her parents got divorced. Neither of them wanted her. So she's here too. This isn't a school, Sophie. It's a place for children who have nowhere else to go. The words settled over me like a heavy blanket, smothering the last tiny embers of my hope. A work trip. A secret adventure. They were just stories. Stories grown-ups told children to hide a truth that was too sharp, too painful to say out loud. My parents weren't on a trip. They were gone. I didn't know how or why, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that they were not coming back for me. The ache in my chest was so big, I thought it might split me in two. That night, I cried into Barnaby's fur, but for the first time, they were silent tears. The kind of tears you cry when you know no one is coming to comfort you. Life became about finding the small things. Chloe and I discovered a loose floorboard under her bed. It became our treasure chest. We collected things: a smooth gray stone from the courtyard, a bright red leaf that had blown in through an open window in the library, a short piece of blue string that had come loose from a cleaning rag. They were tiny, forbidden pieces of a world that had color and texture. After the 9 o'clock bell, we would pull them out and look at them under the sliver of moonlight that came through our window. They were our secrets, our rebellion. One afternoon, about 3 months after I arrived, Mrs. Blackwood summoned me to her office. Her office was as cold and spare as every other room in the house, except for the large, dark desk that dominated the space. "A letter has arrived for you," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. She slid a thin, white envelope across the polished surface of the desk. My heart gave a painful lurch. It was from Aunt Eleanor. Her spidery handwriting was on the front. I picked it up. My fingers were trembling so much I could barely open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The letter was short and formal. It said she hoped I was adjusting well and adhering to the rules. It said it was for the best that I remain at Blackwood for the foreseeable future. It felt like a business letter, not a letter from family. But underneath the letter, something else was in the envelope. I slid it out. It was a photograph. It was of my parents. They were standing in our backyard, under the big oak tree. Dad's arm was around Mom's shoulders, and they were both laughing, their heads tilted together. They looked so happy, so full of life, so real. It was taken before the quiet car ride, before the sharp smell of mothballs, before the giant chessboard floor, before my world had turned gray. I stared at the picture, and the truth that Chloe had given me became a solid, undeniable thing. They were gone, and they weren't coming back. The lie was finally, completely over. I expected to feel a fresh wave of tears, a storm of grief like the one from that first night, but it didn't come. I just felt a profound, aching sadness. I looked up from the photo at Mrs. Blackwood, who was watching me with her usual impassive stare. I thought of Aunt Eleanor's words in my bedroom, a lifetime ago. "You won't need them where you're going." I finally understood. She wasn't talking about my dinosaurs or Barnaby or Princess Amelia. She was talking about my childhood. I wouldn't need the toys of a little girl because I wasn't going to be a little girl anymore. I was going to a place where you had to grow up, fast. You didn't need toys to fight imaginary monsters when you were faced with a real one, a monster made of loneliness and loss. I slipped the photograph back into the envelope. "Thank you," I said, my voice quiet but steady. That night, after the 9 o'clock bell plunged our room into darkness, I showed the photograph to Chloe. We looked at it in the moonlight, this tiny square of a forgotten, happy world. She took my hand, her small fingers linking with mine. "They were beautiful," she whispered. I squeezed her hand. I still had Barnaby, a silent witness on my pillow. But he wasn't for being brave anymore. He was just a memory. My bravery now came from the small, warm hand I was holding in the dark. It came from the shared secret of a loose floorboard, from the quiet understanding that passed between us without words. We were not just two girls in a sad gray room. We were survivors. We were each other's one thing,